Hi, everybody. I hope you're doing well today. This video is going to continue our series on the good life by talking about a theory known as hedonism and some of the advantages that this has. In this video, we'll introduce the theory, talk about what hedonism is and what it has to say about the good life. So, how it relates to this idea of pleasure and happiness. We'll talk about how instrumental values fit into the hedonistic view. And then we'll talk about the advantages of this system of value. We'll talk about the many models of a good life advantage, the advantage regarding personal authority, that it provides us with an intuitive foundation for thinking about value, how it can explain the general rules and exceptions to ideas about the good life, and how it can make a science of the good life possible. So, what is hedonism? Hedonism is the philosophical theory that the one and only thing that intrinsically contributes to a good life is happiness. Now, notice it doesn't just say that happiness is good for you, it says it's the only thing that is good for you, intrinsically. So happiness is necessary for a good life. If you don't have happiness, your life's not going good for you. Happiness is also sufficient for a good life on this theory. If you have happiness, then your life is going good for you. All right, now, keep in mind that we might want to distinguish between happiness you have now versus happiness you have throughout your life. So on the hedonistic view, the more happiness you experience throughout your whole life, the better that life is. The less happiness you have throughout your life, the worse that life is going for you. But what do we mean by happiness here? When the hedonist talks about happiness, they mean something very specific. According to hedonism, happiness is a combination of two things: the experience of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Now, you might think that the word happiness means something else, and that's fine. You could have that sort of debate. But more important here is pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Is that really what the good life consists in? So, the hedonist, putting this together, is the philosophical view that pleasure, and only pleasure, intrinsically contributes to a good life, and that pain and suffering, and only pain and suffering, intrinsically contributes to a bad life. So according to hedonism, your life is going well for you solely to the extent that is filled with pleasure and free of pain. Now, most hedonists are not thinking of pleasure as just this mere physical sensation. So for instance, look, the taste of chocolate, when you eat chocolate, that taste, that's a physical sensation that you have. And that sensation might give you pleasure. So the pleasure is the result of that taste. However, you can also get pleasure from reading a book. Now, reading a book is an activity. It's not a physical sensation that your body has. A better word than pleasure here might then be enjoyment. I think that might be a little bit less misleading than the word pleasure. So this captures the sense in which pleasure on most hedonistic views is an attitude you have towards something rather than a mere sensation. You enjoy the book. You also enjoy the taste of chocolate. That enjoyment is really what the hedonist means by pleasure. At this point, you might be thinking, well, what about all those other things we value? When we came up with those lists, most people had a lot more than just happiness on their list. Well, hedonism doesn't deny that those other things like money, family, friends, health, or a career are ever good for you. Hedonism merely denies that those things are ever intrinsically good or ever intrinsically bad for that matter. That is, in and of themselves, they have no value, positive or negative. These things can be instrumentally good for us to the extent that they lead us to happiness. So insofar as money helps us get happiness, well, it's instrumentally good for us. To the extent that family helps us get happiness, it's instrumentally good for us. Insofar as friends help us get happiness, then those friends are instrumentally good for us. And these things will be instrumentally bad for us to the extent that they lead us away from happiness or towards pain and suffering. So insofar as you become so obsessed with money, that's all you can think of, and it actually makes you miserable. Well, if that obsession with money is making you miserable, then money has now become instrumentally bad for you. If a relationship with friends or family sort of turns sour and it's just sort of draining you of all sort of pleasure, well, to that extent, that relationship is now instrumentally bad for you. But they're going to say the friendship, sort of in and of itself, has no value. It only has value insofar as it contributes to that sort of happiness. And same thing goes for money, family, health, or your career as well. All right, so what are the advantages of this view? Why might someone be attracted to this theory of the good life? Well, one advantage is that hedonism seems to allow for many models of a good life. It avoids a sort of one-size-fits-all picture of the good life. And this is because there are different things that make different people happy. And so the hedonist says, look, a plumber and a philosopher can both live a good life. They don't need to live exactly the same way in order to have a good life. And that's because different things make different people happy. And so what the good life looks like for you might look very different than what the good life looks like for me. What's intrinsically good for us is exactly the same. The means by which we get to that pleasure might be very different. So a second advantage here is that hedonism leads to the view that each of us has a kind of special personal authority over what the good life is for ourselves. And the idea here is just that other people might give us advice, but sometimes that advice seems sort of illegitimate. Like when a parent tries to push a certain career on their sort of child, even though it doesn't really sort of fit their personality. Parents might get it in their mind that sort of being a doctor is a sort of really sort of great sort of career, and they really wish that they had become a doctor. And so they push their kid to try to become a doctor because they think that'd be good for them. But maybe that kid just doesn't really enjoy that kind of work. The idea is we can make sense of why we feel that sort of resistance to people trying to push that kind of life on us, because we know better than we have personal authority. We sort of get to decide what makes us happy. That other person doesn't get to decide what makes us happy. We have that kind of sort of personal authority. But note, however, that hedonism does not say that anything goes. According to hedonists, happiness makes your life better whether you believe it or not. And so according to hedonism, even if we were to find a person who didn't want to be happy, happiness would still make that person's life better for them. A third advantage: hedonism places a widely shared value at the foundation for all thinking about the good life. And in that way, it seems like an incredibly intuitive theory. The idea here is, look, almost everybody just naturally desires their own happiness, their own sort of pleasure. They're motivated by that sort of pleasure. And so in that way, since we all seem to sort of agree that our own happiness is good for us, it gives us a sort of starting place where we can think about sort of value in that way. Whereas other things, look, if I just sort of said, look, philosophy, engaging in philosophy is the good life. Well, not everybody shares that sort of value. And so there seems to be a lot of controversy. So by placing this one value that seems to be shared across different cultures and sort of populations, it seems to provide for an incredibly intuitive theory. Right. A fourth advantage is that hedonism can provide justification for many of the general rules for how to live a good life, and it can often explain many of the exceptions to those same rules. When you made a list of the things you desire and want in your life that you thought were sort of good for you, you probably thought that a lot of those things would show up on most people's lists. Look, I expect most people, if I ask them, what is it you want in life? What do you hope to have, say, 10 years from now? They'd have things on there such as sort of good health, money, food and drink, sort of shelter, friends and family. And I think most of those things would be on people's sort of lists because almost everybody sort of enjoys those things. And that's why, as a general rule, part of the way to sort of get a good life is to have close friends and family. But it can also explain some of the exceptions. Now, look, most people just don't enjoy physical pain. And so for most people, physical pain sort of reduces the quality of their life. But there are some people who enjoy physical pain. And so there might be an exception where for them, experiencing that physical pain gives them happiness and thereby improves their life. All right, advantage 5. Hedonism can provide us with a framework for the empirical study of the good life. So it provides us with a method for investigating and gaining knowledge about how to get to the good life. So it can help realize John Stuart Mill's goal of developing a science of the good life. So our experience and philosophy tells us that happiness or pleasure is the sort of foundational intrinsic value. That's what we discovered through our philosophical reflections and through our own firsthand experience. Once we discover that, we can then use science to experiment and make observations to help try to determine what commonly causes people to become more or less happy throughout their lives. In fact, there's already a burgeoning sort of interdisciplinary field that attempts to do just that. It's known as happiness studies. It involves cognitive scientists, psychologists, social scientists, philosophers, and neuroscientists all working together to try to study the causes of happiness. And they've already run various kinds of social science experiments to discover some intriguing things. For instance, people who make less than a certain threshold tend to be less happy. But once you meet that threshold, people who make more than it don't seem to be any happier than people who are just at the threshold. So for instance, the threshold last time I checked was somewhere around $75,000 a year for the average family of four within the United States. And again, these are averages. And so people who made less than that each year tended to be less happy. But people who made more than that as an average family of four, well, if they made that 75,000, if they met that threshold, if you compare that to someone who makes $1 million a year, the person who makes $1 million a year on average is no happier than the person who only makes 75,000. Getting more money beyond that point doesn't tend to improve happiness. And there's a lot of reasons people suggest this. And it's that, look, once your needs are met, basic needs of shelter, food, you're no longer stressed and worried about meeting those needs. And so you can focus on other things. So yes, a certain amount of money is necessary, it seems. But after that, it doesn't seem it really helps improve happiness. Another thing that people have noticed is people who spend their money on experiences rather than stuff tend to be happier than people who spend their money on just gathering stuff as opposed to on experiences. All right, so overall then, hedonism is a philosophical theory of intrinsic value that appears to avoid dogmatism. So it doesn't just say, here's one and only one way. You have to do this. Philosophy is the only way to get a good life. No, the good life is open to everyone, and there's different ways to get to the good life. Each person also has special authority. There's yet again, I have more authority over what makes me happy. I know better what makes me happy than you do, since I experience it firsthand. It matches many of our intuitions. Yet again, you can imagine someone with a life filled with fame and fortune and family gets to do all these cool things, but if they're just depressed and miserable the entire time, it seems like their life is not really going very well for them. It provides a plausible foundation. It tells us, look, if you want to show that getting a degree is valuable for you, is good for you, will improve your life, then you need to show how it's going to contribute to a happier life for you. Once you've done that, it looks like explanation can stop. And it makes an empirical science of the good life possible because we can investigate the causes. We can use our observations and do experiments to determine what kind of things usually lead people to experience more happiness in their lives or less. However, despite these advantages, we'll see that hedonism faces some big problems that might motivate trying to develop some alternative theories of the good life. We'll look at those in the next couple videos. See you then.